Fantasy for beginners. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hi, my name is Anna, and as you can tell by the title of this video, I really wanted to make a video where I give my opinion on how people can start reading fantasy, because I understand that fantasy can be a very intimidating genre. It can be very scary for new people to start reading fantasy, and I think the two things that I see the most about fantasy and why maybe fantasy is a very not difficult genre to get into, but it's a little bit more complicated to understand, is for two reasons. Number one, the world building. People find the world building to be a little bit complicated or too complex, or it's just a lot of things, a lot of names, a lot of weird names, and we that read fantasy are very much used to those weird names. It's a lot of different cultures, different customs, different people, and then you have the magic system, which you have to understand how it works in order to understand the world. So in terms of world building, it can be a lot, and it can be very overwhelming for fantasy beginner. And number two, usually in fantasy we have so many characters, we have so many different POVs and so many weird names as well, and sometimes we're like, okay, this character is that person's brother, and this character is from that place, and in that place they do this, they do that. So I really wanted to craft a beginner's guide to reading fantasy, because in my previous video, if you haven't seen it, I gave 5 reasons why I think everyone should read fantasy, and I think it would be only correct for a follow-up video on how to start reading fantasy. So these are just my opinions, these are just my tips and tricks, so please don't take it as, that seriously. Please don't think like, oh, this is the only way that I can start reading fantasy. No, this is just, like I said, my opinion and my thoughts, and let's just get right into the video. So just like I said before, fantasy can be a little bit complicated, and it has so many different names, so many different places, so many different characters. So my first tip for you is, if you annotate your books, and if you have no problem in writing your thoughts on your books, underlining things, do the same thing with fantasy, but add 2 tabs. So the annotated system that I use, there's always one tab, and for me it's the green one, where it's world building. So anything that has to do with world building, new societies, new people, new cultures, customs, or anything that has to do with the magic system, how it works, how it doesn't work, what are the rules, all of that, I just underline everything, because I know that I will need that in the future, and I need it to understand how everything works. So my first tip is, if you annotate your books and you don't mind writing in your books, underlining, then create a specific tab for fantasy where it's just everything about the world building. I guarantee you it's going to help you so much, because if you forget anything, you can just go back on those tabs and reread everything, and you're like, oh, okay, so this is how it works. Oh yeah, like this guy's from that place. And the same thing for characters. I have a pink tab where it's everything character related. So what I do in the beginning is, okay, this character is this person. She lives here, she does this, she's part of this community, that community. She has magic powers, she doesn't have magic powers. So that's what I do. Have 2 tabs. So one for world building and one for characters. I guarantee you this is going to help you so much, because you are going to keep track of everything and that is going on, all of the places, all of the cultures, all of the characters. You're not going to get lost, because if you forget something, you can always go back on those tabs. If you do not like annotating in your books, writing in them, if you just use tabs, that is okay too. You can just use the tabs as long as you have different colors for different things. But even if you don't like using tabs, because you're a little bit lazy, you're just a little bit lazy, you don't feel like putting like a tab in every single page or in every single detail. So the tip that I give to you is, at the end of every chapter, glue a post-it note. If you obviously don't mind in your book, just put a post-it note there and write everything that you learned from that chapter. So anything about the world building, anything about the characters, what their motivations are, why are they doing what they are doing, who they are, who are they related to, in terms of the world building, what community they are a part of, etc. So instead of annotating in your books and writing down in your book, essentially what you're going to do is write everything on a post-it note at the end of every single chapter, just so you know what is happening, where you are, what type of characters are we following, and just all of that. So you are just so organized, and you can always go back to the end of the chapters and think, oh, okay, what happened in the last chapter? Okay, so this happened. Oh, we are following this person. That person is from that place. So you are just caught up with everything that is happening, and you don't feel lost. And if you don't like using a post-it note, then I think having a blank sheet of paper next to you is the way to go, because you're not, damaging your book or anything. It is completely on the side, and you can take all of the notes that you want. But mind you, these notes don't have to be extensive. We are not studying, okay? We are not studying for a class. We're not going to write an essay about this particular book. No, it's just little tiny notes of what I've been mentioning about the world building, about the magic system, about the characters, just little things that you can memorize also pretty fast, because if you write long sentences, you don't tend to memorize them as easily. But so just take very tiny notes of what is happening. Essentially do the same thing as I told you before with the post-it note. Just use a blank sheet of paper, just take all of those little notes, and I can guarantee you're not going to feel lost after these 3 tips that I gave you. So if you like annotating, annotate in your book. If you don't like annotating but don't mind gluing post-it notes, I recommend that you use those post-it notes and put them at the end of every single chapter. And if you don't even like doing that, then just have like a blank sheet of paper, or you can even take notes on your phone or your iPad, just little notes. And that's what I want you guys to take from this video. Is from these tips, these notes are very small, they are very concise, they are not something that are meant to be very extensive, because like I said before, we are not studying, okay? This is not studying. We are not studying for any class. This is not a classic. We don't need to take extensive notes, just little things that will help us understand the world and the characters a little bit better. Having all of that said, I do have some fantasy book recommendations for beginners, and I think the best place to start is actually urban fantasy. And the reason why I think urban fantasy is a good place to start, it's because fantasy books that are usually set in our own world, or in worlds that are very similar to our own, is much easier to understand. The person is not going to feel so lost, because we're just starting off with fantasy. So the world building is not going to be that complicated. It's going to be very similar to our own. So we are going to understand everything that is happening at a much quicker pace. The only thing that we have to worry about is the magic system, or the characters, the amount of characters, which in urban fantasy, in my experience, at least from the books that I've read, there are not a lot of characters, so it's not like we're going to be confused. So the first book that I would recommend is actually a book that I didn't really like. I read it last year, but it was just not for me. But just because I didn't like it and it wasn't really for me, doesn't mean that other people are not going to like it. And that's House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I understand that this is adult fantasy, so it can feel a little bit hard, but honestly, in my opinion, it wasn't hard at all. Like, this book is set in a different world, but it's so similar to our own that it's not very hard to understand what is going on, what are the rules, etc. We do have a lot of magical creatures, and I think this is such a great book to get acquainted with, the very common cliche magical creatures such as vampires, angels, werewolves, fae, just all of those creatures that we see time and time again. Because like I said, the world building in terms of structure, in terms of society, or in terms of where it's set, it's not so different from our own. In fact, it's very, very similar. So it's so much easier for us to focus on these magical creatures and what are their customs, what are their cultures. It's just so much easier to understand that. And Sarah J. Maas, one of the things that I didn't really like was the info dumping. It did feel a little bit info dumping in the beginning, in the first 100 pages, but I think that can be actually helpful for someone that is beginning to start reading fantasy, because they at least are told everything. They know everything about all of the different magical creatures, because the author actually explains everything into detail in the first 100 pages. So it might feel a little bit info dumpy, but I think it's good in the sense of, if you are starting fantasy, getting all of this information in the beginning is actually very helpful and very good. And another reason why I think this book is a great way to start reading fantasy is the magic system. It's a very low magic system, which means that it doesn't have a lot of rules, and it's not like you don't understand the magic or what is happening. You do understand it, but there's just not a lot of rules, so anything can really happen. So the magic system is not that difficult to comprehend, and we only have 2 POVs, which are the love interests, Bryce and Hunt, I think these are the names. So it's not hard to follow in terms of characters as well. They are very similar to young people in their 20s. So you can really identify and relate to their personality and how they act, how they don't act. And even if you don't act the same way, you do have friends that act that way, because it does truly feel like they are 20-year-olds. So I think, in my opinion, this is such a great way to start fantasy, because like I said, the world building is very similar to our own, so there's not a lot of rules. It's not very complicated to understand our world. The magic system is low, which means that the magic system doesn't really have a lot of rules, so it's also easy to understand. Third, it's a great way to get acquainted with magical creatures, especially the cliche ones, the ones that I mentioned before. It's such a great way to read about them and understand them fully. And number 4, we don't have a lot of characters to follow, so that is also very easy to follow. It's not confusing. You don't know who is who. You're not going to get confused. So I think this is a great way to start reading fantasy. Even though I didn't like this book, I still think it's a good way to start reading fantasy. The second recommendation that I have is actually Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Now, I will say, this is very much adult fantasy, and if you do like darker themes or you don't mind the trigger warnings, then I would definitely recommend this book, because just like House of Earth and Blood, this book actually is set in our own world. It's set at the University of Yale, so you are not going to be confused. You are not going to be confused. Everything is so easy to understand because we live in it. You know, we live in this world, so we completely understand that. The only thing that you have to understand, which is the fantastical part, are the secret societies that are at Yale, because there are 9 societies, and each society has their own role. They have their own magic. But the magic is also not difficult to understand. It's very much based on rituals and potions and dust, and it kind of feels like witchcraft. I actually think the most similar thing that I can really compare this magic system to is witchcraft and alchemy. Like, it very much does feel like it because of all the rituals and all the potions and everything. So that is also not difficult to understand and get acquainted to. The plot structure is very easy to follow. We have a murder mystery, and I think that would be very interesting for someone starting to read fantasy. You know, starting with a murder mystery, of course, we love those. And we only follow one character, which is Alex Stern, and she, oh my god, like, she is my favorite part of this book. Like, she just feels like an actual character. She has gone through so many things, and you know, she just got into Yale. She has the ability to see ghosts, and that is why she has been hired by Yale. And she's the one that's going to solve the murder mystery. So we are only going to follow Alex Stern, and that makes it so much easier for a fantasy reader, a beginner, to understand, because you only have to understand Alex Stern. Of course, it's important to know her friends and her acquaintances, but still, that is not hard to follow. We are always in Alex Stern's mind, and I think that is a very great advantage. So just like House of Earth and Blood, this book is easy to follow in the sense of there's not a lot of world building, because the world is exactly like our own. The societies are not hard to understand at all. The plot is very easy to follow, and we only have one POV, so the names are not going to be mixed. Now, the third recommendation that I have is for people who love historical fiction. If you love historical fiction, or if you love history, then this book is for you. And I would actually recommend Babel by R.F. Kuang as a fantasy beginner. I know some people might be shocked, like, oh, but why? It is a very complex book, like I said, in terms of history. So if you really like history or historical fiction, you are going to absolutely love Babel. And it's also set in an academic setting, at a school, at Oxford, more precisely. So if you love academic settings, then you are absolutely going to love this. But just like I said, this is set in Oxford, but in the time of colonialism, where the British Empire ruled. So the world is not different from our own. It's just set at a different time. So it's also not difficult to understand. It's not difficult to follow. We also only have one POV, which is Robin. We do have his group of friends, which are 3 other characters, but they are not a POV, so we're only in the mind of Robin. We only follow Robin, and the only thing that you need to know is just, you know, a few other characters, but like I said, not difficult to understand, not hard at all to follow. The plot is also very simple. We do have a lot of commentary, and that's why I said, if you really love the theme of colonialism and how it can affect people and countries, then you're absolutely going to love this book, because R.F. Kuang does an amazing job at doing commentary about colonialism and how it can affect everyone and how it has affected everyone. So if you do love this theme, then you are going to absolutely love this book. The magic system, very, very simple. It's like these silver bars that you can engrain a certain word, but you have to translate it. You have to translate the word, and you have to find the perfect word for the thing that you want. So for example, you have sometimes to translate and engrave words in Greek or Latin or Arabic for those bars to actually do what you want them to do. So for example, if you want a wall to have a passage, you literally just have to engrave the word secret passage in the silver bar, and then just throw it at a wall, and the secret passage will be formed. So it's very simple to understand, and it's also a beautiful commentary on translation and about translation. How is it possible really to translate words? Do we lose a meaning whenever we translate a certain word? All of that commentary is freaking amazing, and that's why I did really like Babel. But like I said, so this fantasy book recommendation is good in the sense of world building is very easy to understand, magic system as well. The characters are easy to follow, but I would only recommend this book if you love historical fiction. So for example, you've been reading historical fiction for a very long time, but now you want to start fantasy, boom, Babel. I think Babel would be the perfect pick for you. And lastly, the last urban fantasy book that I have to recommend is actually The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Now, this is not a book that I really liked or enjoy. I did enjoy it, but it wasn't something that I loved. I don't love it as much as other people do. And the reason for that is because this book is very similar to contemporary fiction, and that's not something that I really read. It's not something that I gravitate towards. But I think this is such a great way to start if you love contemporary fiction. So you really like contemporary fiction, you love reading about slice of life, all these different characters and their growth and their journey, and now you want to step into fantasy. I think The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is such a great way to begin with, because the magic is present throughout the book, but it is so minor, and it's something so minor that it's just so easy to understand. So the magic in this world comes from gods, and Addie, one day, she doesn't really like where her life is going. She doesn't really want to get married, but at the time that this is set in, at the time that Addie LaRue lives, she has to get married. It's something that all women should aspire to, but she doesn't want that. She doesn't want to be chained and her dreams to not come true. So she does ask a wish from a god, but after dark. And you should not ask wishes from gods after dark, because it's not going to be the good gods, you know what I mean? No good god is up after dark. And the wish that she makes, a dark god answers, but she curses her, and she curses people to not remember her. So for example, every person that she meets, if they don't look at her face, they instantly forget her. People that take pictures of her, she doesn't show up in pictures. People just forget who she is, and she does find a little ways to be remembered and to stay a part of history, but she is just never remembered by anyone that she meets. So that is her curse. So as you can see, the magic system is not difficult at all to understand. It is just gods granting wishes, and then it depends on the wishes that you want to be granted, because if you ask wishes from gods after dark, you're also going to get a curse. It is of course related to what you wish. So for example, Addie didn't want to get married. She didn't want to be seen. So she is forgotten by everyone. So in a certain way, of her wish was granted, but no one can remember her, and that is very, very tragic. So the magic system, very easy to understand. The world, we see so many different timelines of our own world. We see the time where Addie was born, which was the 18th century. We follow her through the 19th, the 20th, and then finally the 21st century. So the world is also not difficult to understand, and we only have two POVs, which is Addie and Henry. And oh my god, these two characters, they were my favorite part of the book. I didn't really relate to Addie a lot. I couldn't really relate to her, but my god, did I relate to Henry to this day. I read this book in, I think it was last year. Yeah, it was in the beginning of last year. I think it was January 2023. And to this day, I still think about Henry, and I still think about certain quotes from that book, because Henry really stayed with me. So I do think The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is an amazing place to start in fantasy, because the world is very easy to understand, the magic system as well. We only have two characters to follow. It is not difficult at all. The language is not difficult at all. And if you love reading contemporary fiction, literary fiction, then this is literally the perfect start for you. Another great way that I think people can start reading fantasy is either through retellings or stories based in mythology. And the reason for this is because if you already have an interest in mythology or interest in certain legends, myths, retellings, then it's going to be so much easier for you to understand the story, because generally these books that are based in myths or retellings, they have a lot of elements in common with the said myths and retellings. So the reader, you as a reader, will already know the character names, who they are inspired by, the plot structure, and the story is going to be very, very similar. So you are already familiarized with these topics, the themes, with everything that is going on. So it's going to be much easier for you to understand. And the first book that I actually have to recommend is The Guinevere Deception by Kirsten White. I did read this last year, and it was a big disappointment for me, I'm not going to lie, but that's because I didn't really engage with the story. I didn't like the changes that she made to the Arthurian legend, because I really, really liked the Arthurian legend, but I didn't really like the changes that she made. But I do think this is a great book if you want to start reading fantasy, because everyone knows the Arthurian legend, everyone knows about King Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, Mordred, everyone knows this story and this legend, these myths, so it's such a great way to start reading fantasy. And in this book, The Guinevere Deception, Guinevere actually dies, so Merlin actually sends his daughter to pretend to be Guinevere, so she does transform and she does look like Guinevere, to enter and infiltrate the King Arthur's castle, and she actually marries him, and then here blossoms obviously a love triangle. Honestly, I don't even think it's a love triangle. It's a square, because she has feelings for Arthur, she has feelings for Mordred, she also has feelings for Lancelot that shows up later in the book. So it's just this whole thing on romance, and she doesn't really know who she's going to pick. And honestly, I can't tell you much more because I'm being honest, I don't really remember the story. I didn't really like it enough to remember it, but trust me, it is a good place to start. You might not enjoy the changes that were made to the Arthurian legend like I did, but despite those changes, I think this is a great place to start reading fantasy, or at least get used to all of the different, worlds, the magic, the names, all the different type of characters. It's a great way to familiarize yourself with the workings of fantasy. The next book that I have to recommend is Wicked Fox by Kat Cho. I read this year, and honestly, it's not really for me. It's just not for me, and I think I'm giving up on these type of books not because they are retellings or inspired by mythology. I actually really love that part, and I love myths and legends and everything about it. It's just because it's so romance focused, and I just don't really care. Yeah, like, I'm just not really a romance girly. I don't really care about romance, but this book is based on the mythology, the Korean mythology of the nine-tailed fox. So if you are very familiar with K-dramas, or you're familiar with the Korean mythology, this book is a great start for fantasy, because the world is our own. So that is something that you can relax and think, okay, this is something that I know. I'm not confused by the world. And the magic is not very difficult. It's the magical abilities that a nine-tailed fox has. So it's not very complicated. Super strength, super speed. She's resistant. She can handle a lot of wounds. But what I think this book really excels at is the Korean mythology, because not only do we have the nine-tailed fox, we also have other creatures such as goblins or shamans, just an array of different types of creatures, of different types of myths and legends. So I think this would be a great way for someone to start reading fantasy if they really love Korean mythology. And in the same segue, I would also recommend Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Suen Lin Tan, because this one is based on the Chinese mythology of the moon goddess. And I really like the moon goddess, Chang'e. I think this is how you pronounce it. I really hope so. It's Chang'e. And honestly, the first time I actually met her was in a video game called Smite. I don't know if you know the video game or if you played it. And I really liked her in Smite. So I thought, you know what? People are really raving about this book. Let me read it. I didn't really enjoy the book, but it's not because of the mythology or anything. It was due to the pacing of the story. I just think it was way too fast. But other than that, I really love the world that Suen Lin Tan crafted, because we are in the world of gods. So we see so many different gods from the Chinese mythology, how they interact with each other, their relationships, their dynamics, just everything about it. It was so beautiful and magical. And the strength of this book is truly the writing. The writing was beautiful. It was mesmerizing. And I just remember really falling in love with the writing and the atmosphere that Suen Lin Tan managed to build. It was just truly beautiful. So if you love mythology or Asian mythology, I would highly recommend reading Wicked Fox. That one is much more a fun teenage read. It is YA fantasy, so it's very similar to a K-drama. So if you like K-dramas and Korean mythology, Wicked Fox is for you. And if you are interested in the Chinese mythology, I would highly recommend Daughter of the Moon Goddess. Another good place to start reading fantasy is actually through YA fantasy, because just like any other genre, YA is much more accessible. It is much easier to understand. It is young adult. It's for people until the age of 18. So the writing is not going to be complicated. The world is also not going to be complex and convoluted, and you're not going to be confused, like, where am I? Who is these people? So I think YA fantasy, if you really want to delve into the fantasy world and actually have different worlds, magic systems, a lot of characters, I think YA is a very good place to start. And the very first book that I have to recommend in this YA section is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. Like, I just absolutely love this young adult fantasy, and that would be The Bone Witch by Rin Chapeko. I absolutely love and adore this trilogy, and the reason why, like I said before, this is such a great way to start reading fantasy, because if you want and if you love necromancy magic, if you want just one single POV, then this is the book for you, because we only follow our character Tia. She does have necromantic powers, and those powers are very rare in this world, and she is the only one that can actually kill the Daivas, which are monsters that every set of years resurrect, and they just roam the lands, destroying everything and killing a lot of people. And she is a Dark Asha, which means that she has necromantic powers, and she's the only one that can resurrect these Daivas before they resurrect themselves and kill them, in order to stop cities and villages being destroyed and people being killed. Another point for this book is actually the geisha culture. This is very much inspired by geisha culture, so if you do like geisha culture, I think this would be perfect for you. This does have a world of its own, but like I said, it's very easy to understand. You might be a little bit confused in the beginning, but that is not because the world is difficult to understand. The writing in the beginning can be a little bit confusing, because the first time I actually read it, I was a little bit confused, but if you reread it again, you're going to understand what is going on. And what I mean by reread is not reading the entire book again. It's just rereading the passage where she does explain everything about the monsters and the thieves and how they work. You are going to understand this book. The magic system, very simple, very easy to understand. It's based on runes. So you have runes for fire, water, air, dark runes. And the bigger the rune, the bigger and more impactful the magic spell is going to be. So it's very easy to understand, and the first book does have an academic setting, which is something that I absolutely love. So if you love academic settings, necromancy magic, if you love a little bit of conspiracies, because this will have some conspiracies, this is the YA fantasy for you. I would highly recommend this, and it's just so underrated. So if you want to start fantasy, this is the place to start. And of course, I couldn't do this segment without mentioning Eragon by Christopher Paolini. Now, we all know what Eragon is. We have seen the movie. We have heard so much about it, but I would highly recommend this book because I actually read this last year and I actually really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I thought I was because sadly, I'm not really into YA fantasy anymore, but it was such a fun read. It is so cozy. We are following this little boy, Eragon, and one day he finds a dragon egg. And when the dragon hatches, they immediately form a bond together and he becomes the last dragon rider. If we don't count Galvatorix, which he is the king and he was the last dragon rider until Eragon showed up. So now he has to go on this quest and on this adventure in order to flee his village because it's being attacked by these horrible creatures. They're not orcs, but they are kind of similar to orcs. And afterwards he joins the rebellion against Galvatorix and the story follows from there. This is such a cozy fantasy and it's such classical fantasy, which is an amazing place to start because classic fantasy is where it's at. It's so easy, and although it has been done several times, that's why it's so easy to understand. And we only have one POV, which is Eragon. The magic can feel complicated in the beginning, but I think the author does an amazing job at explaining how it works and how it doesn't work because it's also based on certain words. So it's kind of like spells, if you want to compare it that way. The world is very easy to understand. It's just basically a medieval European type of inspired world. So we have a lot of sword fights, a lot of action. The story is very easy to follow. It's so easy to understand, and I would highly recommend Eragon as your first dive into fantasy. And these last two books that I have to recommend, I actually didn't really enjoy them that much, but once again, I do think these are great places to start in fantasy if you want to start with YA fantasy. And that would be Three Dark Crowns by Kendare Blake and Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Now, the reason why I recommend Three Dark Crowns is because the story is very predictable. It's very easy to understand where it's going to go, so we're not going to get that many surprises. But even though the story is predictable, you can at least get acquainted with the plot structure and how usually it works with fantasy, especially YA fantasy. The magic system is actually very unique, and I actually really enjoyed the magic system. So essentially you have these three sisters that are separated by birth, and they live in 3 islands, and only one of them can rule. And the only way to choose which one is going to rule is the 3 of them have to kill each other, which that premise sounds freaking amazing. I love the premise. And one of them has magic with poison, so she's very resistant to poison. She can create different types of poison. Another one has the magic, I think it's nature, so she has the ability to, I think, talk to animals and kind of have an animal companion. And then the other one has elemental magic, I think. If I'm not mistaken, these are the 3 powers that each of the sisters have. The plot twist at the end, I was not expecting it. I actually wasn't expecting it, and I was actually like, oh wow, like this was such a fun way to turn the story around, because throughout the book I was very much like, oh yeah, this is gonna happen, that's gonna happen, and it was very predictable. But I think this premise of the 3 sisters having to kill each other to pick who is going to be the queen, and the magic system, I think it's so engaging and very easy to understand. The world is not very much explored, so it's not complicated. I wish it was a little bit more explored and we could have seen the rules and the society more, but alas, the author didn't really explore that. But that is also a point in favor because you don't really have to worry about the world building. You do have obviously 3 POVs, which are the 3 sisters, but they are very easy to distinguish between each other, so you're not going to get them mixed up, you're not going to get the plot points mixed up. So Three Dark Crowns, even though I didn't enjoy it, I would highly recommend it to start reading fantasy just for the premise alone, because that premise is very engaging. And the reason also why I recommend Six of Crows, it's because this one is actually a step up from the Three Dark Crowns in my opinion. It has a heist, okay? Who doesn't love a good heist? Who doesn't love Ocean's 11? We all do. And just that premise alone hooks you in right away. You're just going to absolutely adore the heist. You're going to absolutely adore the characters. I think we might have It might be 5 POVs, and I know it seems a lot, but like I said, these characters, they're all part of a group, so you're going to be very much acquainted with them. You're going to understand their motives, their reasonings, their personality. You're going to learn how to distinguish every single one of them, so do not worry with the amount of POVs in it. So the world building is very easy to understand, so you don't really have to worry about that. It's actually very much inspired by Eastern culture here in Europe, specifically Russia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So if you do like Russian culture, customs, I think you're absolutely going to love Six of Crows. And these 2 books are also such good ways to start reading fantasy. And last but not least, if you do want to start with some adult fantasy that is easy to understand, I do have 3 recommendations for you. And the first one is actually Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. Now, I do see that a lot of people think this is overhyped, and I understand where that comes from, but I really, really enjoyed this book. And the reason why I think this is such a good place to start reading fantasy, it's because the world is very, very easy to understand. It feels very much like D&D. If you love D&D, you're going to find a very fun time in here because the world is just so easy to understand. We have a lot of different classes. You understand what different class can do. You have so many different monsters and creatures, and just everything is just so magical and just so freaking cool. You are going to love this world, I guarantee you. And it's not hard to follow at all. The names can be a little bit weird, of course, because these are magical creatures and monsters, but it's just so much fun to read about, and you're going to have so many different type of monsters and creatures. You're going to learn so much from this, and you're going to have a ton of fun with this book. And the premise of this book is this band that you see here in the cover have disbanded a long time ago, but they have to join forces again because one of them actually needs their help because his daughter's trapped in a city surrounded by monsters. So it's basically a siege, so the band has to join together in order to save his daughter. And off they go. They are now 50 years old, so the back and the knees, they do not work the same. And that is something also that I think this would be a very great way to start because the humor is so funny. I absolutely laughed when I was reading this book. The humor is so freaking funny. The story is so easy to follow. The characters are so lovable. And although you have a lot of funny moments, you also have a lot of heartwarming moments as well. This is such a perfect way to start reading fantasy. You only follow one POV, which is this guy here at the front. You see his perspective, his motives, his thoughts, his feelings, just everything. And everything is just so wonderful. And it's such a great way to start reading fantasy due to the world, all of the creatures in it, and you will have tons of fun with this book. And of course, I could not enter this segment without recommending a Brandon Sanderson book, and in this case, I would recommend Elantris as your first dab into fantasy. And the reason why, it's because even though this is Brandon Sanderson, and you might think, oh my god, it's so complicated, he writes all of these complex and complicated worlds. This one is very easy to understand because this was his first published book, so his writing is going to be easy to understand. The world is easy to understand. The magic system is a little bit complicated, but once you get the hang of it, you get the hang of it. In fact, this is like the easiest world that you are going to find in the Cosmere universe, just so you know. So this premise of this book is we have an abandoned city called Elantris, and nobody lives there except for the people who have caught this strange illness that makes them their hair fall out, makes their skin turn spotches of black. They just start decaying essentially, and they become immortal. But the thing is about being immortal and about not dying is that if you break a bone, for example, you are going to feel that pain forever. So it's not a beautiful thing. It's not something that is amazing, like, oh my god, immortal. No, like, it's actually very awful. And one of our characters actually ends up in Elantris because one day he wakes up with a disease. His hair is falling, he has black splotches on his body, and he is sent to Elantris. And then we have another POV, which is a princess, and I do not remember the kingdom's name at all, but she was supposed to marry our other main character that got the disease because he was the prince of, I also don't know the kingdom names. I really forgot. I just legitimately forgot all of the names of the places, which it doesn't look good in my opinion. I'm so sorry. So she goes to his kingdom, and people tell her that he died because they are so ashamed to say that he has that disease because the belief is the people who have that disease aren't really favored by God, and they were cursed. So the king would rather say, oh yeah, like, my son died, other than he's actually in Elantris. And then we have a third POV, which is a priest, and he's trying to conquer all of the kingdoms through his religion. So he's trying to impose his religion to other people, and he's using the Elantrians, so the people who have caught this disease, in order to say, yeah, like, these people and your people are not chosen by God. My God is the true one, so you have to convert. So it is a very political centered story, but in my opinion, it's not hard to understand at all. You always know what is going on, and the characters are just so heartwarming to follow. Obviously, at the end, at the very end, like, this bit Standard everything starts making sense. You just get plot twist after plot twist after plot twist. But I think this is such a great way to enter the fantasy world, especially the Cosmere world. At that, if you do want to enter the Cosmere world, please start with Elantris. Although this seems and can seem a little bit complicated, I promise you it is not. If you read this with a lot of care and very slowly, you will understand everything that is going on, and you will get acquainted to fantasy very, very fast. And last but not least, I would also recommend The Magician by Raymond E. Feist. And now, this one was very, very popular, you know, in the beginning of the 2000s, because this has such a classic fantasy feel, and it can seem complicated at first because it's an entire saga. So in this world, you do have almost, like 20 something books, but obviously you don't have to read them. I am recommending only the first trilogy, because you only follow, I think, 2 POVs, which is, you follow maybe 3 or 4 POVs, but they are very easy to distinguish between each other because their personalities are very different. The world is very easy to understand because the world was clearly inspired by European medieval times, so it's a typical fantasy setting in my opinion. The magic system is not hard to understand at all. In fact, it's very, very simple, and you are going to follow Pug in that sense because he is the one that's going to become the magician, the chosen one, if you will. He's going to become an immortal being, and you are going to understand everything about magic. The story is very much quest centered, so you are going on a quest, you are defending your kingdoms, you do have an invasion from another dimension. It's just, everything is just so easy to understand, because even though you do have an invasion from a people literally from a different planet, you don't really get to know them, you don't really get to know their culture. So Raymond E. Feist doesn't explore their culture in this trilogy, so it's not something that you need to understand. So it's not another load, let's just say, that you have to comprehend and that you have to read about. It's really just about Midkemia, and it's very similar to medieval Europe, just like I said. So this book is a great, amazing way to start reading fantasy. In fact, this was the first trilogy that I was like, yeah, this is it. Like, fantasy is amazing, fantasy is stunning, it's beautiful. I read this back in 2019, and I read the 3 books in 1 month, which, I kid you not, I had never done that before, and I just absolutely had to, because this story gripped me in such a way that I couldn't put the books down. So I would highly, highly recommend The Magician by Raymond E. Feist if you want to start reading fantasy, if you want to start reading adult fantasy. At that, I think it would be an amazing start to that journey. So the premise of this book is, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, we do have this kingdom, which I do not know the name. Okay, I've read that so long ago that I don't remember the name of the kingdom, but we follow Pug. He's a young boy. He wants to become a knight, so he has to become, I don't know how to say it in English. I'm going to try and find the word in English and just write it, right here, because I'm really not, I just cannot remember the word. I'm going to say, like, a knight apprentice. So he wants to become a knight apprentice, right? But one day a mysterious boat actually lands on the beach where he lives, and mysterious human beings start coming out of that boat, and people don't really know what to make of them. And once they know it, they are being invaded literally by people that they have never seen before. They don't understand their language, they don't understand what is going on. The only thing that they can do is defend themselves. He actually joins the group to run away and help the king in the front lines because he is a knight apprentice, but he is captured and he is taken to that mysterious world, and it's in that mysterious world that he's going to learn everything about magic, and he's going to become very, very good at it. He's going to excel at it. He's going to become actually the chosen one, and he is going to flee that place and come back to Midkemia and solve everything. So this is very much the premise of the book. So you have a lot of action, you have a lot of battles, you have just a lot of things happening at once, and that's why I absolutely love that book, because everything and all of the politics, everything was just intertwining so beautifully, and that's why I was just so gripped to that story. So if you really want to start reading fantasy, start with The Magician by Raymond E. Feist. And that is it for this video, guys. I really hope these tips and tricks help you to start reading fantasy. So just like I said before, I'm just going to do like a small recap. If you want to annotate in your books, please annotate everything that you need to know, every single piece of information, every single character, just so you don't get lost. If you don't like annotating in your books, write in a post-it note, glue it at the end of every single chapter. And if you don't like doing that, then just write in a blank sheet of paper. Mind you, these notes are supposed to be very small. They're not supposed to be essays. You're not studying this book. It's just little pieces of information to help you. And please pick one of the books I recommended to you from either urban fantasy, mythology-based books, YA fantasy, or adult fantasy. Pick one of these. I really hope they are suited for fantasy beginners. And if you end up reading one of them, please let me know what you think of these books, if you think they are actually good for fantasy beginners. If they're not good, if you have any other books for fantasy beginners, please let me know down below so I can maybe make a part 2 of this video. Who knows? Please like and subscribe. It would really help my channel out, and I will see you guys on my next video. Bye.